The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a scream trapped inside metal walls, and I was the one who had to listen to it first. My name is Ethan Marsh, and I was standing at the tactical station of the Ashen Vow when the ship's old computer, older than most of the crew combined, printed a single line across every screen on the bridge. Human species status, extinct. I read it twice before my hands stopped shaking enough to type a response. There was no response to give. The Dominion had just declared us gone, wiped from every record, every star chart, every list of living things worth counting, and the worst part was that they were almost right. We were 167 people, that was it. That was all of humanity, floating in the cold dark beyond the Kuiper Belt, hiding inside a ship that groaned every time the engines fired, because parts of her hull were older than my grandfather. We were the last ones, not the last soldiers. Not the last survivors of some battle, the last humans anywhere, in the entire galaxy. Captain Laura Quinn stood behind me, her arms crossed, her jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. She did not say anything for a long moment. She just stared at those 4 words on the screen, like she was daring them to be wrong. "Pull up the last transmission from Seoul," she said finally. I did not want to. I had heard it 11 times already, but I pulled it up anyway, because when your captain gives an order, even a quiet one, even a broken one, you follow it. The recording crackled to life. A woman's voice, calm in the way that only comes right before everything falls apart, read out coordinates, then read out casualty numbers, then simply stopped. Not because she finished, because the signal died. Somewhere in that silence, Earth had gone dark forever. I had been 11 years old when the Dominion first arrived. I remembered the sky turning orange over the city where I grew up, not because of a sunset, but because of ships entering the atmosphere in numbers that blotted out the horizon. I remembered my mother's hand gripping mine so hard it hurt, and I remembered thinking, even then, that grown-ups were supposed to know what to do, and none of them did. 10 years later, here I was, 21 years old, sitting at a console on a ship that was the last home humanity had, watching an alien empire officially close the book on my entire species. "They're not even going to bother hunting us," said Oliver Finch, our pilot, from the seat beside me. He had a habit of saying the quiet part out loud, usually at the worst possible time. Why would they hunt something they think is already dead? He was right, and that fact alone made my skin crawl. The Zorath Dominion did not do things quietly. When they conquered a world, they announced it. When they crushed a resistance, they broadcast it across 1,000 systems, as a warning to anyone else who might get ideas. They wanted every species under their control to see what happened to those who fought back. Humanity had fought back harder than most, and it had cost us everything. But somewhere in the last year, the message traffic had changed. Fewer patrols near our last known positions, fewer scans, and now, finally, the declaration. Extinct, filed, forgotten. Captain Quinn walked to the front viewport and looked out at the stars, the way she always did when she needed a moment before speaking to the crew. She was not a tall woman, but she had a way of standing that made her seem like she took up the whole room. I had served under her for 3 years, ever since the fall of the last human colony on Kepler's Reach, and I had never once seen her cry. Not even when we buried 42 crew members in the vacuum outside that dying station. "Ethan," she said, without turning around. "Get everyone to the mess hall. All of them. I want every single person on this ship to hear this together." I nodded, even though she could not see me, and I moved through the corridors of the Ashen Vow, knocking on doors, pulling people from bunks and engine rooms, and the tiny hydroponics bay, where Grace Bell grew the only fresh vegetables any of us had eaten in months. 167 people. I knew every single one of their faces. I knew their names, their families, the worlds they used to call home before those worlds stopped existing. When we were all gathered in the mess hall, shoulder to shoulder because the room was never built to hold this many people at once, Captain Quinn stood at the front and told us what the Dominion's own records now said about us. Nobody screamed, nobody cried out. There was just a silence so heavy it felt like it might crush the hull from the inside. Then a woman near the back, an older engineer named Claire Whitmore who had lost her entire family in the second wave of attacks, spoke up in a voice that did not waver. "Good," she said. "Let them think that." A few heads turned toward her, confused. Captain Quinn did not look confused at all. She looked like she had already arrived at the same thought, and was simply waiting for someone else to say it first. "Explain," the captain said. Claire stood, and even though she was not in charge of anyone, the whole room seemed to lean toward her. "For 10 years, they have hunted us across half the galaxy. Every ship, every colony, every hiding place we found, they eventually found too. We have spent a decade being prey. But prey only gets hunted when the hunter believes there is something left to catch. I understood then, the way you understand a held breath finally being released. If the Dominion believed we were extinct, they would stop looking. Their patrols would thin out around our territory. Their attention would move to other conquests, other species still resisting them in the open. And in that gap, in that blind spot carved out by their own arrogance, we could move. They think we're dead," Claire said. "So let's stop trying to prove we're alive, and start acting like ghosts instead." I looked around the mess hall, at the faces of my crew, my family, the last of an entire species. There was fear there, plenty of it, but underneath the fear, I saw something else beginning to form. Something sharper, something that had not been in this room in a very long time. Hope does not always look like light. Sometimes it looks like a plan whispered in the dark, built by people who have nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. Captain Quinn let the silence stretch just long enough for the idea to settle into every mind in the room. Then she spoke again, and her voice had changed, had gained a weight it had not carried a moment before. "We go dark," she said. "No more distress calls. No more attempts to reach other resistance cells. As far as the galaxy is concerned, humanity died with Saul. We are going to let them believe that, for as long as it takes." "As long as it takes for what?" asked Nathan Price, our senior gunner, a broad-shouldered man who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. Captain Quinn's eyes moved across the room, meeting each of ours in turn, before she answered. "As long as it takes to make them regret it." I felt something shift in my chest at those words, something between terror and purpose. We were not talking about survival anymore. Survival had been the only goal for 10 years, and it had nearly finished us. This was something new, something that scared me more than the Dominion ever had, because it meant choosing to stay hidden, even when every instinct screamed to fight, to be seen, to prove we still existed. But Claire was right. Being seen was what had gotten so many of us killed. Over the following hours, the ship buzzed with a different kind of energy than I had felt in years. Grace Bell disappeared into the engineering bay with a pad full of notes, muttering about power signatures and how to make our engines run quieter than a whisper. Oliver Finch pulled up old star charts, searching for places so forgotten, so useless to the Dominion, that no patrol would ever think to look there. Nathan Price began an inventory of every weapon system on board, not to prepare for a fight, but to make sure nothing would accidentally give away our position. I found myself back at the tactical station, staring at that same line of text still glowing on my screen. Human species status, extinct. I thought about deleting it, closing the file, moving on to something more useful. Instead, I left it there. I wanted to remember exactly what the galaxy believed about us, because I had a feeling that belief was about to become the most powerful weapon we had ever built. Captain Quinn found me there an hour later, alone in the dim light of the bridge, everyone else finally resting after the longest day any of us had faced in months. "You should sleep," she said, though she made no move to leave herself. "So should you," I answered. She allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first I had seen from her in weeks. "There will be time for sleep later. For now, I need you thinking. You have a good mind for this, Ethan. I need you to help me figure out how ghosts move through a galaxy that thinks they don't exist." I looked at the screen one more time, at those 4 cold words that were meant to erase us from history. "They made a mistake," I said quietly. "They should have kept looking." Captain Quinn's smile faded into something colder, something that reminded me she had survived things I could not fully imagine. "They will learn that soon enough," she said, "but not yet. First, we disappear. Completely. And when we come back, it will not be as the species they buried. It will be as something they never prepared for." Outside the viewport, the stars continued their slow, indifferent drift, unaware that somewhere among them, In a battered ship with a groaning hull and a crew of 167, humanity had just decided that being counted as dead was the beginning of something far more dangerous than being alive. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. We sat with the weight of what we had chosen, the strange comfort of a plan taking shape, and the quiet, burning certainty that the galaxy's greatest mistake was believing it had already won. For the first time in 10 years, I did not fall asleep afraid. I fell asleep waiting. The plan Captain Quinn described that first night sounded simple when she said it out loud. Disappear completely. Move quietly. Wait for the right moment. But turning a wounded battlecruiser and a crew of exhausted survivors into something truly invisible was nothing like simple, and I learned that the hard way over the following months. Grace Bell was the one who carried the heaviest part of that burden. She had been an engineer on a Dominion supply route years before the invasion reached her homeworld, and that strange piece of her past turned out to matter more than any of us could have guessed. She knew how their systems worked from the inside, not just how to fight against them, but how to think like them. Every ship in Dominion space broadcasts an identification signal, she explained to me one evening, her hands stained with grease, as she worked beneath an open panel near the engine core. It tells other ships and stations who you are, where you're from, what you're doing there. Ours still broadcasts as a human vessel, which is basically a flashing sign telling every scanner in range that a ghost just walked past. So we turn it off, I said. If only it were that easy. She wiped her hands on a rag and looked up at me, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and determination. A ship broadcasting nothing at all is almost as suspicious as one broadcasting the wrong thing. We need a signal that says something believable. Something that makes scanners glance at us and look away. It took her nearly 6 weeks, working with scraps of salvaged Dominion technology, pulled from a derelict supply depot we found drifting near an abandoned mining belt, to build something she called a false skin. It was not a disguise in any way I originally imagined, no painted hull or new markings. It was a signal, a lie broadcast in a language only machines could read, telling any scanner that crossed our path that the Ashen Vow was a decommissioned Dominion vessel, stripped for parts, of no interest to anyone. The first time we tested it, sailing past the edge of a minor trade route where a Dominion patrol should have flagged us instantly, I held my breath the entire time. Nathan Price stood at the weapons station, ready to fight even though fighting was the last thing any of us wanted. Oliver Finch kept one hand on the controls, prepared to run the moment anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The patrol ship passed within visual range and did not so much as slow down. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding for nearly a full minute. Around the bridge, I saw the same relief on every face. The same disbelief that something this simple could actually work. They didn't even look twice, Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might undo the miracle. Why would they? Grace answered, a tired smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. Dead things don't need a second glance. That success gave us something we had not had in a long time, something more valuable than any weapon or shield. It gave us confidence. But confidence alone does not keep a ship fed, and it does not repair a hull that groans louder every time we push the engines past half power. We needed resources, and the only place to find them was inside Dominion territory itself. Captain Quinn called the crew together again, this time not in the crowded mess hall but in smaller groups, department by department, so that no single conversation would carry the weight of the entire plan all at once. When she spoke to the bridge crew, she laid it out plainly. There is a supply depot 3 systems from here, she said, pointing to a star chart projected above the table. According to old records, it was abandoned after a battle years ago, damaged but never fully destroyed. If any of its systems still function, we could use it. Parts, fuel, maybe even weapons the Dominion never bothered to recover. And if it's not abandoned? Nathan asked, always the one to voice the risk everyone else was thinking about. Then we use the false skin, and hope Grace built it well enough to fool more than a passing patrol, the captain answered. I caught Grace's eye across the table. She did not look worried. She looked like someone who trusted her own work, and somehow that steadied my nerves more than anything the captain could have said. We approached the depot 3 days later, the Ashen Vow drifting through the dark with her engines running at the barest whisper of power Grace could manage. I sat at tactical, watching sensor readings that told a story of destruction long since gone quiet. scorched hull plating, broken docking arms. No active defenses that I could detect, though that fact alone did nothing to calm the tension coiling in my stomach. Life signs? Captain Quinn asked. None, I answered. But there's still power running through parts of the station. Something down there is alive, at least mechanically. We docked carefully, using an old maintenance airlock rather than the main port, just in case anything about our arrival triggered an automated alert somewhere deep inside the station's systems. Captain Quinn led the boarding party herself, along with Nathan, Grace, and me. Oliver stayed behind at the helm, ready to pull us away at the first sign of trouble. The inside of the depot was a graveyard of twisted metal and dead consoles, lit only by the dim emergency lighting that had somehow survived whatever battle tore this place apart. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the empty corridors, and more than once I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half convinced something was watching us from the shadows. This place has been dead a long time, Nathan muttered, running a gloved hand along a scorch mark on the wall. Not everything here is dead, Grace said, crouched beside an access panel, her eyes bright with the particular excitement she reserved for machinery most people would have written off as scrap. This power conduit is still active. If the main system survived, we might be able to pull data as well as parts. Captain Quinn's expression sharpened at that. What kind of data? Depends on what's left, Grace said. But if we're lucky, supply routes, patrol schedules, maybe even communication logs. I understood immediately why that mattered so much. We were not just looking for parts to keep our ship running. We were looking for a map, a way to understand exactly where the Dominion's attention was focused and where it was not, so that we could move through the gaps like water finding cracks in stone. It took hours of careful work, rerouting power, coaxing ancient systems back to life just long enough to extract what we needed, before Grace finally managed to pull a working data core free from its housing. She held it up like it was made of glass, cradling it against her chest as we made our way back toward the airlock. This, she said, might be worth more than every weapon on this station combined. She was right, though none of us fully understood how right, until we returned to the Ashen Vow and began sorting through what the data core contained. Supply routes stretching across a dozen systems, patrol patterns updated as recently as 3 months prior, and buried within layers of encryption that took Grace nearly a week to break, something far more valuable than either of us expected. A record of the Dominion's own internal reports, including the exact reasoning behind their declaration that humanity was extinct. I sat beside Grace in the small workshop she had claimed as her own, reading through the translated files on a cracked screen that flickered every few minutes. The report was written in cold, clinical language, the kind that treats the end of an entire species as nothing more than a line item to be closed. Human resistance activity has ceased across all monitored sectors. No verified sightings in 14 months. Species classified extinct. Resource allocation for continued search operations terminated. 14 months. That was how long it had taken for an empire that once hunted us across half the galaxy to simply stop looking, to decide we were no longer worth the resources it took to confirm our deaths. There was something deeply insulting about that, and something deeply useful at the same time. They didn't even confirm it, I said quietly, reading the line again. They just assumed. Assumptions are a gift, Grace said, not looking up from the screen. Assumptions mean they stopped double-checking. I thought about that for a long time afterward, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone looking for what might be hiding underneath. The Dominion had built an empire on the idea that they always knew everything worth knowing, that their scans and their patrols and their vast intelligence networks left nothing to chance. And yet here we were, 167 ghosts sitting inside their own supply data, reading their own confident mistake back to ourselves. Over the following weeks, that data became the foundation of everything we did. Oliver used the patrol patterns to chart routes through Dominion space, where the chance of encountering a ship was almost non-existent. Nathan studied the supply schedules, looking for depots and way stations similar to the one we had already stripped, places where a quiet, unremarkable ship might slip in and out without drawing attention. And Grace kept working on the false skin, refining it further, based on everything we learned about how Dominion scanners actually classified vessels, closing gaps we had not even known existed. Captain Quinn spent those weeks doing something I had not seen her do in years. She planned. Not the desperate, reactive planning of a captain trying to keep her crew alive one day at a time, but the deliberate, patient planning of someone building toward something larger. She would sit for hours with the star charts, tracing routes with her finger, murmuring to herself, crossing out ideas and starting again. I asked her once, late at night when the rest of the crew had gone to rest and only the two of us remained on the bridge, what exactly she was building toward. She did not answer right away. She kept her eyes on the star chart in front of her, tracing a line between two systems I did not recognize. For 10 years, she finally said, we ran. We hid. We lost people every single time the Dominion found us, and every single time, we told ourselves that survival was enough. That staying alive was the victory. She looked up at me then, and there was something in her eyes I had never seen there before. Something that looked almost like the beginning of hope. I don't want survival anymore, Ethan. I want them to understand what it cost them to stop looking for us. I did not fully understand what she meant that night, not the way I would come to understand it later. But I remember feeling something shift inside me as she spoke, some quiet certainty settling into place. We were not simply hiding anymore. We were preparing. 3 months after we stripped that first depot, we hit a second one, then a third, each time growing more confident, more precise, more familiar with the strange, careful choreography of moving like ghosts through a galaxy that had already buried us. We took only what we needed, left no trace behind that could not be explained by ordinary decay, and vanished again into the dark before anyone came looking. It was during our 4th such run, deep inside a sector the Dominion barely bothered to patrol anymore, that Nathan spotted something on long-range scanners that made every one of us go still. Captain, he said, his voice carefully controlled in the way that told me he was working hard to keep it that way. You need to see this. On the screen, drifting near the edge of a dead system, was a ship, small, damaged, clearly not Dominion in design, and broadcasting, faintly but unmistakably, a distress signal in a language none of us had heard since before Earth fell. Captain Quinn stared at the screen for a long moment, and I watched something complicated pass across her face, hope and caution wrestling for control. That's not a Dominion signal, she said quietly. No, Grace confirmed, already pulling up what data she could gather. It's not. For the first time in longer than I could remember, we were not alone. The distress signal pulled at something inside all of us, something we had trained ourselves to ignore for years. Every instinct built by a decade of running told me to look away, to plot a course around that dying ship and keep moving toward the next depot on our list. But Captain Quinn did not give the order to turn away, and I understood why the moment I saw her face. We had spent so long believing we were the only ones left, that the possibility of another living thing out there, hunted and hiding just like us, was not something any of us could simply pass by. Bring us in slow, she said. Weapons ready, but do not fire unless fired upon. Oliver guided the ashen vow toward the drifting vessel with the same careful patience Grace had taught our engines to move with, a whisper instead of a roar. As we drew closer, the shape of the ship became clearer on the view screen. It was smaller than ours, built with curved lines that looked nothing like human design, and nothing like Dominion design either. Long scorch marks ran along one side of the hull, and half of what I guessed was an engine housing had been torn away entirely, leaving jagged metal exposed to the vacuum. Whoever they are, Nathan said, studying the damage, they didn't lose that fight easily. They didn't win it either, Grace added quietly. We docked using the same careful maintenance airlock approach we had used at the depot, unwilling to risk a direct connection to a ship we knew nothing about. Captain Quinn led the boarding party again, this time with Nathan at her side, and a small medical team following close behind, led by our ship's doctor, a soft-spoken woman named Sophie Lane, who had kept more of us alive over the years than any of us liked to admit we owed her. The airlock cycled open into darkness, broken only by the dim glow of a single emergency light flickering somewhere deeper in the ship. The air inside was thin and cold, but breathable, which told us the life support had held on just long enough. We found the crew, or what remained of them, in a cramped chamber near the center of the vessel. There were 4 of them, tall and slender beings with pale gray skin and large dark eyes that reflected the emergency light like still water. 3 were unconscious, their breathing shallow but steady. The 4th, a female with a jagged scar running down one side of her face, was awake, and the moment she saw us, she pressed herself back against the wall, her eyes wide with a fear I recognized instantly, because I had felt it myself more times than I could count. Captain Quinn raised both hands slowly, palms open, a gesture that needs no shared language to be understood. "We're not going to hurt you," she said, her voice steady and calm. The woman did not relax, not entirely, but she did not attack either. She studied us for a long moment, her gaze moving from face to face, lingering longest on Captain Quinn. "Human," she said finally, the word rough and unfamiliar in her mouth, as though she was pulling it from a memory long buried. "You are human." I felt the room go very quiet at that. None of us had expected her to know the word at all, let alone recognize us by it. "You know of us?" Captain Quinn asked carefully. The woman gave a small, tired laugh that carried no real humor in it. "Everyone in Dominion space knows the story of the humans, the species that fought back harder than any other. The species the Dominion could not fully erase, no matter how many worlds they burned." Her eyes moved across our faces again, and something in her expression shifted, disbelief slowly giving way to something like wonder. "But the Dominion says you are gone, extinct. I did not believe it was possible you could still be out here." "We are very good at not being where they expect us," Captain Quinn said. Sophie moved carefully past the captain to check on the unconscious crew members, her medical scanner humming softly as she worked. The woman watched her with wary eyes but did not stop her. "Who are you?" Nathan asked. "And who did this to your ship?" The woman's expression darkened, old grief and fresh anger mixing together in a way I understood far too well. "My name is Keth. My people are called the Aveline. We were once a peaceful trading species, before the Dominion decided our home system had resources worth taking." She gestured weakly at the damage surrounding us. "We resisted, as your people did. We are paying the same price your people paid, one world at a time. This ship carries what remains of a resistance cell that was supposed to reach a hidden colony 3 systems from here. A Dominion patrol found us instead." I felt something twist painfully in my chest at her words. It was like listening to our own history, spoken back to us through a different voice, a different species, but the same terrible shape of loss. "How many of you are left?" Captain Quinn asked quietly. "In your resistance, I mean. Not just this ship." Keth's jaw tightened. "I do not know anymore. Communication with the other cells was lost months ago. For all I know, this ship carries the last of us, just as you believe your ship carries the last of you." The silence that followed felt heavier than any I had experienced since the day the Dominion declared us extinct. Captain Quinn looked at Keth for a long moment, and I could see something forming behind her eyes, some idea taking shape that had not existed a few minutes earlier. "You said everyone in Dominion space knows the story of the humans," the captain said slowly. "What exactly do they say about us?" Keth studied her, clearly trying to understand why that question mattered so much in this moment. "They say you refused to surrender, even when surrender would have been easier. They say you built weapons out of scrap and hope, and made the Dominion bleed for every world they took from you. Some species speak of you as a warning. Others speak of you as—" She hesitated, choosing her next word carefully. "As an example." "An example of what?" I asked. Keth's dark eyes met mine, and for the first time since we had found her, something like a spark of defiance flickered across her exhausted face. "Of what it looks like to refuse to be erased." Captain Quinn was quiet for a long moment after that, her gaze distant, as though she was looking at something far beyond the walls of that damaged ship. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a weight I had not heard in it before, not even during our darkest moments over the past 10 years. "Keth," she said, "how many other species out there still remember us that way? Still resist, still hide, still refuse to give the Dominion what it wants?" "Many," Keth answered without hesitation. "Scattered, disorganized, hunted, just as you are, but many." I watched understanding pass across Captain Quinn's face, like sunrise breaking over a dark horizon, and I finally began to grasp the shape of the plan that had been forming in her mind for months, ever since that first night when Claire Whitmore stood up in the mess hall and said the words that changed everything. Good, let them think that. We were not the only ghosts in this galaxy. We were simply the ones who had learned, through hard and bitter experience, exactly how to move unseen. We brought Keth and her surviving crew aboard the Ashen Vow, repairing what we could of their vessel, and stowing it in our cargo bay, rather than leaving it to drift as a marker of where we had been. Sophie worked through the night to stabilize the unconscious Aveline, and by morning, all 4 of them were resting quietly, alive, because a distress signal had reached ears willing to listen, instead of ears trained only to survive. Over the following days, Keth told us everything she knew, and it was more than any of us had dared to hope for. Resistance cells scattered across a dozen systems, made up of a handful of different species, all fighting the same slow, losing battle against an empire that had grown too confident in its own dominance. Some of these cells still fought openly, and paid for it in blood every single time. Others had learned, out of desperate necessity, some of the same lessons we had learned: how to hide, how to wait, how to let an overconfident enemy believe a threat no longer existed. They are scattered because they believe they are alone, Keth said, sitting up in the small medical bay, her strength slowly returning under Sophie's careful care. Each cell thinks it fights by itself, against an empire too vast to defeat. If they knew others still fought as well, still survived as well. She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Captain Quinn finished it for her. They would stop fighting alone, the captain said. And an enemy that has convinced itself its enemies are dead has no idea how many ghosts might be standing behind a single knife. That night, for the first time since Earth fell silent, I watched Captain Quinn call every department head to the bridge, not to discuss survival, not to discuss hiding, but to discuss something that felt dangerously close to hope. Grace brought her data core, still holding secrets we had not fully unlocked. Nathan brought a tactical assessment of every weapon and defense system we had managed to salvage over the past months. Oliver brought star charts marked with every safe route we had discovered through Dominion space. And Keth, still weak but sitting upright, with a fierce light in her dark eyes, brought something none of us could have salvaged from any depot or supply run: knowledge of a galaxy full of other ghosts, waiting, without knowing it, for someone to finally reach out through the dark. "We are not simply going to survive anymore," Captain Quinn told the room, her voice carrying the same steady certainty that had kept 167 people alive through 10 years of impossible odds. "We are going to find them. Every scattered cell, every hidden resistance, every species the Dominion believes it has already broken. And we are going to remind them that they are not alone, the same way Keth just reminded us." "That's not a small plan, Captain," Nathan said carefully. "That's not hiding in the dark anymore. That's building something they'll eventually have to notice." "I know," Captain Quinn answered, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she smiled. A real smile. Tired, but genuine. "That is exactly the point." I sat there on the bridge, surrounded by the last of humanity, and the first allies we had found in 10 long years, and I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Not just hope, purpose. The Dominion had declared us extinct and moved on, confident that an empty grave required no further attention. They had no idea that inside that grave, something patient and determined was quietly gathering strength, learning, growing, and waiting for exactly the right moment to prove them wrong. Over the following weeks, guided by Keth's knowledge and the data Grace continued to pull from every depot we visited, we began reaching out. Carefully, quietly, never revealing more than necessary, never risking the safety of a resistance cell we could not yet protect. We used coded signals hidden inside seemingly ordinary supply chatter, messages that would mean nothing to a Dominion scanner, but everything to someone desperate enough to be listening for exactly the right pattern. The first response came almost a month later, from a resistance cell hiding among the ruins of a bombed-out mining colony 3 systems away. A short, cautious message, barely more than a handful of words, but words that told us everything we needed to know. "We hear you, we are still here too." I remember standing on the bridge when that message came through, watching Captain Quinn read it silently, watching her shoulders straighten in a way I had not seen since before Earth fell. She turned to face the crew gathered around her, and though her voice remained steady, I could hear something new underneath it, something that had been buried for 10 long years beneath grief and survival, and quiet, aching loss. "We are not the last ghosts in this galaxy," she said. "We are simply the ones who found each other first." None of us knew yet how far that single message would eventually carry us. We did not know that within a year, that quiet, careful network of hidden signals would grow into something the Dominion would come to fear, more than any open rebellion they had ever crushed. We only knew, in that moment, that the silence we had carried for so long had finally been broken, not by defeat, but by connection. And somewhere out among the stars, an empire that had already closed the book on humanity had no idea that the final chapter had not yet been written at all. A year passed the way years do, when every day is spent balancing patience against urgency, and by the end of it, the Ashen Vow was no longer simply a hiding place for 167 humans. She had become something closer to a heart, quietly pumping messages and supplies, and hope, through a network of scattered resistance cells that stretched further than any of us had dared to imagine when Keth first spoke those cautious words in her damaged ship. I sat at tactical more often now, not because I was tracking threats, but because I was tracking connections. Grace had built a communication system, layered so deeply inside ordinary supply chatter, that even the most attentive Dominion listener would hear nothing but routine noise. Behind that noise, though, an entire quiet rebellion was learning to breathe again. There were the Aveline, Keth's people, who had rebuilt 3 separate cells into a single coordinated force once they realized they were not fighting alone. There were the Threll, a stubborn silver-skinned species who had resisted the Dominion for almost as long as humanity had, and who greeted our first contact with open suspicion that slowly, carefully, turned into trust. There were smaller cells too, scattered survivors from a dozen different worlds, some numbering only a handful of people, each one convinced, until we reached them, that they alone still carried the memory of resistance. "We're not building an army," Captain Quinn said one evening, standing before the growing star chart that now marked every known cell across a widening stretch of Dominion territory. "Not yet. We're building a nervous system. Every cell out there is a nerve ending. Right now, they're all firing separately, uncoordinated, easy to isolate and destroy one at a time. We are the thing connecting them." I understood what she meant more clearly with each passing month. A single resistance cell, however brave, however determined, could be found and crushed by a Dominion patrol without much difficulty. But a network of cells, informed of each other's movements, capable of drawing attention away from one another, capable of striking in coordinated silence rather than scattered desperation, was something entirely different, something the Dominion had never truly faced before, because every species they had conquered had fought either completely in the open or completely alone. We were neither. Nathan spent that year turning our small ship into something sharper than its size suggested it should be, salvaging weapon systems from abandoned depots, and quietly distributing improved technology to allied cells, whenever we could do so safely. Grace expanded the false skin technology she had built for our own ship, adapting it for other vessels within the network, teaching allied engineers how to make their ships whisper instead of shout across Dominion scanners. Oliver mapped safe routes not just for us, but for an entire hidden web of ships that had learned to move through Dominion space like smoke through a closed door. And Captain Quinn, more than anyone, became something the resistance cells had not had in a very long time. Not a commander exactly, not at first, but a voice they trusted. A reminder that being hunted did not mean being alone. It was Keth who finally said out loud what many of us had begun to think privately. "You keep calling this a network," she said one evening, standing beside Captain Quinn, as the two of them studied the star chart together. "But a network only shares information. What you are building is something more than that." "What would you call it then?" the captain asked. Keth considered the question carefully before answering. "A fleet that does not yet know it is a fleet." Those words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward long after the surface had gone quiet again. I remember looking at Captain Quinn's face in that moment and seeing something new take root there, an idea too large to voice immediately, but too important to ignore. It took another 6 months of careful, patient work before that idea became something we could actually act upon. 6 months of drawing scattered cells closer together, without ever risking the safety any single one had fought so hard to maintain. 6 months of proving, again and again, that trust between hunted species was worth more than any weapon we could offer them. The moment everything changed came not from us, but from the Dominion itself. Grace intercepted the transmission during a routine data pull from a depot near the edge of Threll territory, buried inside layers of encryption that took her 3 sleepless days to break entirely. When she finally brought the translated report to Captain Quinn, her face carried an expression I had rarely seen on her, somewhere between fury and disbelief. "They're planning something," she said, setting the datapad down on the table with more force than necessary. "A coordinated strike against every resistance cell we've made contact with, all at once. They call it unified cleansing." The room went very still. "How did they find out?" Nathan asked, his voice low and dangerous. "They didn't find out about us," Grace clarified quickly. "This isn't about the network. This is about them finally deciding to finish what they started years ago, cell by cell, world by world, before any of these species can rebuild enough strength to matter. They don't know we exist. They just decided it was time to stop leaving loose ends." Captain Quinn read through the report herself, her expression darkening with every line. The Dominion's plan was thorough and brutal in its simplicity. Simultaneous strikes against every known resistance stronghold across a dozen systems, timed to prevent any cell from warning another, designed to crush what remained of organized resistance in a single, decisive blow. "When?" the captain asked finally. 6 weeks, Grace answered. 6 weeks, to warn cells that had spent years learning to trust almost no one. 6 weeks, to coordinate a response across a network that had never once acted as a single unified force. 6 weeks to decide whether the fleet Keth had spoken of, the fleet that did not yet know it was a fleet, would rise to meet this moment, or shatter under the weight of it before it ever truly had the chance to exist. Captain Quinn did not hesitate for long. "We warn everyone," she said. "Every cell, every ship, every hidden colony in that network. And then we give them a choice. Scatter and hide, as they always have, or stand together for the first time, and give the Dominion a fight they are not prepared for. They've spent years learning to survive by staying separate," Keth said quietly. "Some of them will not trust a plan that asks them to gather in one place, especially not on such short notice. Then we will have to earn that trust faster than we ever have before," Captain Quinn answered. "Because the alternative is watching everything we have built over the past year die in a single coordinated strike." What followed was the most difficult month any of us had faced since the earliest days after Earth's fall. Oliver spent nearly every waking hour charting the fastest, safest routes to reach every Allied cell in time. Grace worked around the clock, refining our communication network to carry a message this urgent without risking discovery. Nathan coordinated with Allied engineers across a dozen ships, preparing weapon systems and defensive strategies for a confrontation none of them had ever trained for. And Captain Quinn, along with Keth, personally reached out to every resistance leader within the network, cell by cell, explaining the threat and the choice that came with it. Some cells refused outright, choosing instead to scatter further into hiding, unwilling to risk everything, on a plan built by a species and a network still so new to them. I understood their fear, even as it frustrated me. Trust built over a single year could not always outweigh caution built over a decade of loss. But many chose differently. By the 5th week, a picture began forming that none of us could have imagined when Keth's damaged ship first drifted into our sensor range. 17 resistance cells, representing 6 different species, had agreed to gather at a designated rendezvous point, a dead system far enough from any major Dominion presence to remain hidden until the moment we chose to act. 17 cells, each battered, each undermanned, each carrying scars from years of fighting an empire that had never once considered them worth fearing. 17 cells that were about to become something the Dominion had never faced before. I stood on the bridge of the Ashen Vow as ship after ship arrived at that rendezvous point, strange and varied vessels representing species I had only recently learned to recognize, each one carrying survivors who had spent years believing they fought entirely alone. Watching them gather, watching that empty system slowly fill with the quiet, determined presence of a fleet no one had planned to build but circumstances had demanded, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. I felt like we might actually win. Captain Quinn stood at the center of that gathered fleet's command network, her voice carried across every Allied vessel through a communication system Grace had built specifically for this moment, strong enough to unite them, careful enough to remain hidden from Dominion detection. 6 weeks ago, she said, her voice steady, Despite the enormity of what she was about to ask of everyone listening, the Dominion decided it was finally time to erase what remained of us, cell by cell, believing none of us were strong enough or connected enough to stop them. They were wrong about that, the same way they were wrong when they declared my own species extinct over a year ago. I watched the tactical display show ship after ship holding steady, listening, waiting. "We are not going to wait for them to strike first," Captain Quinn continued. "We are going to take the one advantage no enemy expects. We are going to use their own confidence against them, exactly the way my people have been doing for the past year. They believe their targets are scattered, weak, and unaware. We are going to prove otherwise, all at once, in the place they least expect resistance to exist at all." She paused, and in that pause, I could feel the weight of everything that had led us here. 10 years of loss, a year of careful, patient rebuilding, 17 resistant cells, 6 different species, and 1 battered human ship that had once been declared the last remnant of an extinct species. "They call their plan unified cleansing," she said. "Let's show them what unified actually means." Across the gathered fleet, ship after ship signaled readiness, a wave of quiet determination spreading through a network that had spent years believing unity was a luxury none of them could afford. I sat at my station, watching those signals arrive, and felt the shape of everything Captain Quinn had built finally settle into focus. We were no longer simply ghosts hiding in the dark, hoping to be forgotten. We had become something the Dominion's own arrogance had made possible without them ever realizing it. A fleet built from species they believed too broken to unite, led by a people they had already buried in their own records. The Empire had counted every human dead. They were about to learn exactly how wrong that count had been. The dead system where our fleet gathered had no name that the Dominion bothered to record, only a designation buried deep in old survey logs, a place too empty and too resourceless to interest anyone worth watching. That emptiness was exactly why Captain Quinn chose it, and it was exactly why, 3 days after the fleet finished assembling, we used it to plan the strike that would determine whether everything we had built over the past year survived the coming weeks or died with it. Grace's stolen data had given us more than supply routes and patrol schedules this time. Buried within the Dominion's own planning documents for unified cleansing was something far more valuable than we had first realized, a detailed map of exactly where their forces would gather before launching their coordinated strikes. A staging point, positioned at the edge of a shipyard complex the Dominion considered too secure and too far from any active resistance to require heavy defense. "They're not expecting an attack there," Nathan said, studying the tactical display with the kind of focused intensity I had come to associate with him whenever a real fight was finally within reach. "They're expecting to launch an attack from there. Completely different posture, completely different level of readiness. Which means their defenses will be thin," Captain Quinn said, tracing the shipyard's layout with one finger. "Thin enough that a coordinated strike from 17 cells, hitting simultaneously from multiple approach vectors, could cripple their ability to launch unified cleansing before it ever begins." Keth studied the plan carefully, her sharp eyes catching details the rest of us might have missed. "This is not simply defense," she said slowly. "This is an offensive strike against a Dominion staging ground. If we succeed, we do not merely survive their plan, we destroy their ability to execute it at all." "That's the idea," Captain Quinn confirmed. I felt my pulse quicken at the sheer scale of what she was proposing. For 10 years, humanity's entire strategy had revolved around survival, around avoiding confrontation whenever possible, around running rather than striking. This was something else entirely. This was 17 cells, 6 species, 1 shared purpose, choosing to become the hunters instead of the hunted, for the first time in longer than any of us could remember. The following days were spent in careful, exhausting preparation. Oliver worked with pilots from every allied cell to coordinate approach vectors that would bring our combined fleet into striking range without triggering early detection. Nathan and Keth's people worked together, refining a targeting sequence that would prioritize the shipyard's defense grid first, opening a window for the rest of the fleet to strike the vessels still docked and unprepared for battle. Grace, along with a team of engineers from 3 different allied species, finished adapting the false skin technology across enough ships to buy the fleet crucial extra minutes before the Dominion scanners recognized the true nature of what was approaching. Captain Quinn spent those days moving between ships personally, speaking with commanders and crews across the fleet, listening as much as she led. I watched her build something during those final days that no amount of technology or tactics could have created on its own. Trust. Real trust. Forged not through grand speeches, but through countless small moments of honesty about the risks ahead, and respect for every life that would be spent pursuing them. The night before the strike, I found her alone on the bridge, staring at the tactical display showing our entire assembled fleet. 17 scattered points of light finally gathered into something resembling a single, purposeful shape. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "Wouldn't be much of a captain if I could," she answered, though there was no real complaint in her voice. "Tomorrow, we either prove that unity can beat an empire that has spent centuries convinced nothing ever could, or we prove them right about everything they believe regarding species like ours." "For what it's worth," I said, "I don't think anyone on this fleet believes we're about to prove them right." She allowed herself a small, tired smile at that. "Neither do I, Ethan. But belief and reality don't always agree, and tomorrow we find out which one wins." The strike began before dawn, by the Dominion's own internal clock. 17 ships dropping out of hidden approach vectors in near-perfect synchronization. False skin technology holding just long enough to close the distance, before Dominion scanners finally recognized the threat bearing down on them. By then, it was already too late for them to mount a proper defense. I sat at tactical aboard the Ashen Vow, watching the battle unfold, across a display crowded with more activity than I had witnessed in years. Nathan's targeting sequence struck first, a coordinated barrage tearing through the shipyard's primary defense grid, before its operators fully understood what was happening. Alarms, I could only imagine, blared across Dominion vessels, caught completely unprepared. Crews, scrambling toward battle stations they had never expected to need, on what was supposed to be a routine staging assignment. "Defense grid down to 40%, Grace called out from her station, monitoring the battle's progress through data pulled directly from the shipyard's own compromised systems. "They're trying to scramble reinforcements, but their communication network is fragmented. They don't know how many ships they're actually facing." That confusion, more than any weapon we carried, became our greatest advantage. Dominion forces, trained for centuries to fight enemies who attacked alone, in the open, with predictable patterns born from desperation rather than coordination, simply did not know how to respond to a unified strike from 6 different species acting as a single, purposeful force. Ships that should have coordinated a defense instead scattered in confusion, uncertain whether they faced 17 separate threats or one far larger than anything in their record suggested. I watched Keth's people strike the docked vessels with a precision born from years of desperate resistance, disabling engines and weapon systems before crews could fully mobilize. I watched Threll's ships, silver hulls catching the dim light of the shipyard's damaged systems, tear through what remained of the Dominion's organized defense, with a fury I recognized instantly, the fury of a species that had waited far too long for exactly this kind of chance. And I watched the Ashen Vow, our own battered, groaning ship, move through the heart of the battle, with a confidence I had not felt since long before Earth fell silent, striking targets Nathan identified with ruthless efficiency, dodging return fire that grew increasingly desperate and disorganized as the battle wore on. "Captain," I called out, watching a new signal appear on the tactical display. "Dominion Command is attempting an emergency broadcast. They're trying to alert nearby patrols." "Grace," Captain Quinn said immediately. "Can you cut that signal?" "Already on it," Grace answered, her hands moving rapidly across her console. The signal died before it could complete, cut off by a system Grace had spent months perfecting specifically for a moment like this. Isolated, confused, and increasingly overwhelmed, the Dominion forces at that shipyard fought on for another 20 minutes, before the last organized resistance finally collapsed. Ship after ship, either disabled or destroyed, the staging ground for unified cleansing, reduced to a field of drifting wreckage, and stunned, defeated survivors. When the battle finally ended, silence fell across the Ashen Vow's bridge, the kind of silence that comes not from emptiness, but from the sheer weight of what had just been accomplished. I looked around at the faces of my crew, exhausted, tense, but alive, and felt something shift permanently inside my chest. "Status report," Captain Quinn said quietly. "All 17 Allied vessels report minimal casualties," Nathan answered. his voice carrying a note of disbelief, even as he read the numbers. The shipyard's defense grid is completely disabled. 12 Dominion vessels destroyed. Another 9 disabled, beyond immediate repair. Their staging ground for unified cleansing no longer exists in any functional capacity. Keth's voice came through the fleet communication network moments later, carrying an emotion I had rarely heard from her since the day we found her drifting ship. "Captain Quinn," she said, "my people have not won a battle of this scale in longer than I can remember. We did not simply survive today, we struck back, and we struck back together." Across the fleet's communication network, similar reports began arriving from every allied cell, disbelief slowly giving way to something that sounded remarkably like the beginning of real hope. Species that had spent years, some of them decades, believing resistance meant nothing more than delaying an inevitable defeat, had just proven, together, that the Dominion's confidence had blind spots large enough to change everything. Captain Quinn stood at the center of the bridge, looking out at the tactical display showing our fleet, battered but victorious, gathered around the ruins of what had once been a symbol of Dominion dominance in this region of space. They built their entire plan around the assumption that we were too scattered, too weak, and too isolated to ever unite against them, she said, her voice carrying across the entire fleet network now, every allied ship listening. "Today, we proved that assumption wrong in the most decisive way possible. But this is only the beginning. The Dominion will not simply accept this loss quietly. They will come looking for answers, and eventually, they will come looking for us." "Let them come," Nathan said firmly. "They will," Captain Quinn agreed, "but not on their terms anymore. From this point forward, they fight an enemy they do not understand, made up of species they believed too broken to matter, led by a people they have already declared extinct in their own records." I sat at my station, watching the aftermath of the battle stretch out across the tactical display, and thought back to that first night when those 4 cold words appeared across every screen on the ashen vow. Human species status. Extinct. It felt like a lifetime ago, though barely more than a year had actually passed. The Dominion had made a mistake the day they decided humanity was no longer worth watching, no longer worth hunting, no longer worth fearing. That mistake had given us the one thing no empire, however vast, could ever fully guard against: time, hidden in plain sight, to become something they never saw coming. We spent the following days repairing what damage the fleet had sustained, tending to wounded crew members across a dozen different species, and beginning the slow, careful work of deciding what came next. The destruction of the unified cleansing staging ground had bought us time, but all of us understood that time would not last forever. The Dominion would recover, reorganize, and eventually respond with the full weight of their considerable power. But for the first time since Earth fell silent, that coming response did not feel like an ending, waiting to happen. It felt like a challenge we were finally prepared to meet. Captain Quinn called the fleet's commanders together, 3 days after the battle, gathering representatives from every allied species aboard the Ashen Vow, for the first time since our network had come together. Keth stood among them, along with leaders from the Threll and 4 other species I had come to know over the past year, each of them carrying the same mixture of exhaustion and determination that I saw whenever I looked in a mirror those days. "What we accomplished together proves something the Dominion never expected any of us to prove," Captain Quinn told the gathered commanders. "That being counted among the defeated does not mean remaining defeated forever. That an empire built on the assumption of endless dominance has weaknesses it has never once had to defend, because no one has ever united enough species against it to find those weaknesses before." "What happens now?" Keth asked, voicing the question I could see reflected in every face around that table. Captain Quinn looked around the room slowly, meeting the eyes of every commander gathered there, before finally answering. "Now," she said, "we stop hiding what we've built. Now, we let the galaxy see exactly what happens when species the Dominion believed, broken beyond repair, decide, together, to become something far more dangerous than any single resistance ever could." I felt the weight of those words settle over the room, over the entire gathered fleet, over everything we had endured to reach this moment. 10 years of running, a year of quiet, patient rebuilding. And now, finally, the beginning of something that would force an empire confident in its own eternal dominance to reckon with a truth it had never once bothered to consider. The empire had counted every human dead. They had never once counted on what those humans, and the allies they gathered around them, would become once given the chance. Word of the shipyard's destruction reached Dominion High Command within days, though it took considerably longer for them to understand exactly what had happened, and longer still for them to accept that the scattered, supposedly broken resistance movements across their territory had somehow found a way to act as one. Grace intercepted fragments of their internal communications over the following weeks, panicked reports, and contradictory theories about what force could possibly have coordinated such a precise, devastating strike. None of those reports, not even the most paranoid among them, considered the possibility that humanity might be involved. As far as Dominion records were concerned, we remained exactly what they had declared us over a year earlier: extinct, filed, forgotten. That mistake, more than any weapon or tactic we had developed, remained our greatest advantage. Captain Quinn understood this better than any of us, and in the months that followed, she built our growing coalition around exactly that principle. We did not reveal ourselves as the architects of the Dominion's growing troubles. We remained, publicly, exactly what the Empire believed us to be: ghosts. A footnote, in a war they thought long since won. But privately, quietly, carefully, the fleet that had gathered in that dead system continued to grow, continued to strike, continued to prove, one careful victory at a time, that an empire's confidence in its own eternal dominance was perhaps the single greatest weakness it had ever allowed itself to carry. I did not know then, sitting on the bridge of the Ashen Vow in the quiet aftermath of our first great victory, exactly how far this would eventually carry us. I did not know that within another year, the very foundations of Dominion control across this region of space would begin to crack under pressure they still did not fully understand. I only knew, watching Captain Quinn stand at the center of a fleet built from species the galaxy had written off as broken, that something fundamental had changed, not just for humanity, but for every species that had ever been counted among the defeated. We had stopped being ghosts hiding from an empire that had already buried us. We had become something the Dominion had never once prepared to face, a fleet built from the very species it believed too shattered to ever unite, rising quietly from the wreckage of its own overconfidence, patient enough to wait, and strong enough, finally, to strike back. The Empire had counted every human dead. That single fleet, born from grief and patience and the stubborn refusal to disappear quietly, was about to prove exactly how wrong that count had always been, and rewrite the history of an entire galaxy in the process.